When it comes to shooting two different types of photography, if you're shooting landscape and then you might be doing other things, i.e. like wildlife, as we've been doing over the past couple of days, there's some really cool things you can do in your camera to make sure that it's set up correctly, and you can also quickly change between those two collection of settings that you might want to use. I've obviously been shooting with a Z9 over the past couple of days, and the easiest way to do it on a Z9 is by using what are called shooting banks. Now, if you've got a Z6 or a Z7 or a Z6 II, Z7 II, they use what are called user modes. I'll speak about those a little bit later, but when it comes to menu banks and shooting menu banks in the Z9, you have the choice of being able to choose between menu bank A, B, C, or D. You have the ability to rename these menu banks. So as you can see here, I've got menu bank A set to landscape and menu bank B set to my wildlife settings. And these allow me to quickly change between a whole collection of settings. And that means I can have my image quality settings, I get my focusing settings, anything that's in the shooting menu bank can be changed accordingly and stored in menu bank A or B. If you enable extended shooting menu banks, that will then store your shutter speed, aperture and ISO settings. This is really useful to be able to switch quickly from, say, 90 seconds, f8 with an ISO of 64, which would be completely useless for wildlife stuff, to then all of a sudden switching into a wildlife setup and being able to say something like 1,600th of a second, f2.8 or f4 depending on the lens you're shooting, and then being in something like auto ISO if you're in an area with variable light, and that would also then be able to change your focusing settings as well. So extended shooting menu banks can really take that an extra step further, because you're not just changing the settings in the menu, you're also then changing the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO to reflect that as well. If I've got a landscape shot set up, I can then make sure that I'm in shooting menu bank A, and then if I've got a wildlife shot set up and I just want to make sure I've got those settings dialed in, I can quickly change over to B, and it will just bring back all of my most used wildlife settings, so that correct shutter speed, that correct aperture and ISO. If I don't do that, I might be in a situation where my camera was last used for landscapes and I like to do really long exposures with filters, so you might be in a situation where that shutter speed is set to 30 seconds, 60 seconds. It can take some time to get back to that 800th of a second, 1,000th of a second to really give you the shutter speed that you want. And in that time, you could have lost the subject. So being able to quickly change your camera or have your camera set up really nicely to help you make sure that it's set correctly for the types of shots you want to shoot is really, really important, and make sure you get the most out of your camera when you're using it in difficult situations. Now, obviously I've been talking about the menu banks there that are built into Z9. There's also a lot of other Nikon cameras that have the ability to use shooting menu banks. When it comes to the other Z series cameras in the Z range, they employ what are called U1, U2 and U3. Now, these user modes are fully customizable, and you can again choose things like your settings, you can choose your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO. You can also choose the settings in the menus. You can also customize eye menus and buttons and so on. So if you do have a Z6 or another camera in the Z series range, that's where you're going to employ U1, U2 and U3. For example, you would have U1 set to your landscape for your long exposure and an aperture value that gives you a larger depth of field. You might have your ISO set nice and low, especially if you're tripod based. And then you might have U2 set to wildlife, so if you're in a situation where you're using a fast shutter speed with a bright aperture, so you might be shooting at 2.8 or f4 or 5.6 depending on the lens you're using, and then if you're in a variable lighting situation, you might be using auto ISO. Also going to remember, between U1, U2 and U3, you can have different function button setups. I have some different buttons that are set up for landscape and some different buttons that are set up for wildlife. And then also, you can have different focusing settings set up as well, because I always want to be in something like single point for landscapes, and I don't always want to use single point for wildlife. There's some of the other modes like wide area small or wide area large that I do like using for wildlife on my other Z series cameras as well.